Ashley, I thought I'd start with you, and if you could just tell a little bit about your work. Really fascinating work, working with theater, working with the incarcerated in this country and Brazil, and just how you got into it, and what are some of the things that you wish more people knew about it?
Thank you so much, Pete. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to finally get to meet Russell Shoatz in person. We've been talking a lot on Zoom and on the phone for a long time, and it does my heart good to see you in person. I came to this work about prisons because my father went to prison when I was 15 in Texas and stayed there for 20 years and 5 months. And during his incarceration, I wanted to know what had happened to the other people who had family in prison. So by the time I got to graduate school, I had spent most of my life not talking about the fact that my father was in prison, and he'd been locked up for 8 or 9 years at the point when I decided to write a play, an interview-based play, about other people who had family in prison, because I wanted to find out where the families were. I'd spent all that time feeling like I didn't know anybody else who had a loved one in prison except for the people that I was meeting in prison visiting rooms. And then when I started telling people, by this point I was in graduate school working on a PhD in theater and ethnic studies, and when I started telling the people around me that my father was in prison, it turned out that all of the other folks of color, my family is Latino, Chicano from the Mexican border, and when I started talking to all the other people of color I knew in graduate school, everybody else had at least one family member, sometimes many, who were in prison. And they had never bothered to tell that to me, even if they knew my father was in prison, because there wasn't a good or safe reason to talk about it. So when I started working on this play about the families of the incarcerated, all of a sudden, all these people in my life came out of the woodwork as also having loved ones in prison, and they had plenty to say about it. I didn't really have to interview people. I just said, my father is in prison, and I'm trying to find out what happened to your family. And then sometimes people would talk for 4 hours without me asking another question, because there was no safe place to have that conversation. So a lot of my work in the years that have followed has really focused on finding ways to feel a part of that community of people who share this completely earth-shattering life experience of having a loved one in prison that shapes everything about how I live my life, and also trying to figure out how to write about families and people in prison in ways that are thoughtful and honest and really tell the stories of our communities, because the vast majority of writing that people do about prisons is very deceptive and misleading and very focused on violence and crime and the drama of the law, as opposed to the real life consequences for what happens to people's families. So now I'm a theater professor at the University of Michigan, and the majority of my work there, particularly, I guess it's more fun when we're not in a pandemic, we take students into prisons to do collaborative arts work with incarcerated people through this program called the Prison Creative Arts Project. Some of you all heard my husband Phil Chrisman yesterday talk a little bit about the Michigan Review of Prisoner Creative Writing, which is the journal of writing by incarcerated folks in the state of Michigan that he edits and that we publish. And I wrote a book called Prison Theater and the Global Crisis of Incarceration, which is about the theater work that I got to see incarcerated people doing in 10 different countries around the world. So that's who I am. That's what I do.
And Russell, of course, you've done a lot of work too with the families of the incarcerated. I remember attending last September with my daughter an event down in Philadelphia, and it was really striking, just the kind of support group you've built for those who never feel like they can mention their family member. The Mother's Day events you've done, and could you tell a little bit about that work, how you got into it, and what's kind of become important to you from it, you know, over the years of working with families who have somebody in prison?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Pete, and your daughter, and the Hoff, for coming to that family prisoners event, because it was in West Philadelphia. It was on 52nd Street. It was in the hood, but we have a full farm there in the hood on 52nd Street. A little Hoff there. We have a little Hoff. We have our own little Hoff there in the hood, with our animals, with our horses, with our, with our green and our patio, and but many houses, tiny houses that we're building there. If you want to learn more about that, One Art Community Center that Pete came to support us doing a family prisoners dinner. But we do that. we do a gang of work around families of the incarcerated, simply because I'm a family of the incarcerated. And that is work, I'll be doing for the rest of my life. But the intersection is obviously my father, but that isn't the end of that work and how it comes about. And so I will always be doing that work, again, because some of the reasons that, Ashley mentions. But I think it's super important for us to recognize in our communities, also as individuals, that it is key and probably more imperative than anything that our ideas around liberation, our ideas around religion, our ideas around the things that ground us or base us, that we actually put proper energy into them, that we actually do our due diligence in those ways, and that it's not just ideology, it's not just talk, it's not just a book, but we're actually manifesting those things from the book, from the ideology, whatever it is that you say that you believe, then we actually need to see that manifested through you and your everyday actions and community as an individual. And so that's a big part of my work daily. I'm just trying to daily manifest what it is that I say I believe.
So let's talk a little bit about Russell Maroon Shoats, your dad, Russell, because his story, it seems to me, touches on so many of the aspects that have been widely and hotly discussed, not always helpfully, since the death of George Floyd. And so I'm not going to say a lot more, but Ashley, perhaps you'd like to start. Just tell us how you first encountered, Maroon's story, and what are the kind of the things that you, what does it tell you? Why is it an important story?
Well, I hadn't heard of Russell Maroon Shoats until Pete asked me to write this article. So I wanted to know what that was about, because I was actually not ignorant entirely of the work of the Black Panthers or the Black Liberation Army, which are groups that Russell Maroon Shoats has been a part of. But I had never heard of Maroon, which seemed really odd, the greater amount of research that I did about his incredible life. He's the person who, to the best of my knowledge, has escaped from Pennsylvania prisons more than anybody in history, unless somebody has surpassed him that I haven't heard about yet. And he did incredible political organizing work outside of prison and inside of it. And his revolution, he's a man of many revolutions. He went through a lot of different journeys. Some of his political work was very violent, and some of it actually was incredible peacemaking work that really brought people together and organized protests from when he was in prison in solitary confinement of families in the free world who managed to change how visiting happened at the prison where he was held. So the range, the intellect, the amount of work that he has done in the nearly half century that he's spent in prison is a truly remarkable story among the people who've done active political work, those folks from the 60s and 70s who we have known a lot about. I'm mystified as to why we haven't yet really been calling forth the name Russell Maroon Shoats on a national level to a far greater degree than we have. And in the academic literature, his name is almost entirely absent. So I'm honored to be part of what I see as a very necessary recovery project of a significant portion of not just Russell's family history, but the history of political organizing in the United States today.
Now, there's a really interesting twist to the story. So Russell Maroon Shoats, just so everyone gets the main details right, was an organizer in Philadelphia who was convicted in 1972 of an involvement in the shooting death of a police officer in connection with the Black Panther Party. Russell, it's amazing. A few years ago, you told me for the first time about your foster dad, who almost made it up here today, a Pentecostal minister from Philadelphia, Papa Barnes. Interestingly enough, Papa Barnes is in fact a police officer, a Philadelphia police officer himself, who could well have been in the place of the man who died. Could you tell us a little bit about that story, and also how does it help us think about violence and justice?
For years, even the years that I produced Blue Magazine with the Bruderhof, I never really felt 110% comfortable with the duality, the dichotomy, the intricacies of the fact that I was literally raised by a man of the cloth who was also a police officer. So there's not many police officers that are men of the cloth, period. Just period. So my childhood friend, we're in first grade, we're doing the, bring your mom and dad to school to talk about their job. And his dad comes in with the police uniform on, and I hang out with this guy all the time, and at that moment I'm young, so I can't differentiate between Panthers and BLA members and police. It's all whatever, I'm a kid. So to make a long story short, this guy knows my dad, he knows my dad's case, he knows who I am as a child, and he invites me over. His son, me and his son do homework all of the time together. But he says, come on over, do some homework, so I come over, it's pizza. So that's cool. It's pizza. I love pizza. Everybody loves pizza as a kid. And so after we do our homework, I'm about to get out of there, and he says, hey, you coming over tomorrow? And I'm like, nah, probably not. He's like, well, we're going to have pizza again tomorrow. Y'all have pizza again tomorrow? With a police officer standing with a pizza pie, a pizza and a police officer. And I said, oh, well, that's a bet. I'll see you. And what about the day after that? Pizza on the third day? Oh, we got pizza every day if you want it. We'll be doing math every day then. And so that relationship grew into him not just mentoring me, but he mentors this whole block, 52nd and Delancey, at that point in time, one of the biggest drug blocks in Philadelphia. And he comes out and scrapes up the dead bodies of the young who've been shot in the middle of the street. And he continues mentoring, and he continues trying to get people to go to church and all of that. But he never put any pressure on me to try to go to church. He never put any pressure on me to not be on his block doing the things in the street that I shouldn't have been doing. No pressure, but always mentoring, like, what are you doing out here this time of night? And so this interaction was tough on me in the context of me trying to live and embody a specific type of ideas and ideologies that are put out around people like myself and my dad, and who you are, what you should be associating with, who you should be associating with, all of those ideas. And probably up until 5 years ago, I just grasped the ability to be able to say, this is my non-biological father. He's a police officer and a minister. And I support him in the movement the same way that I support my biological father. And you need to do the same. And so that also brought him to a space, and we had always had conversations about my father, but brought him to a space where he was saying to me, what is it that I need to do for your father as a police officer? What is it that I need to say as a pastor? What is it I need to say as a bishop to your father, for your father, in a paper, in a visit, whatever it is I need to do, I'm here for you to do that. So that is a kind of condensed version of Papa Barnes. And I really actually don't feel comfortable being here, having this conversation about him without him being here. And I try very hard, and we all try very hard to get him here. But moving forward, he is an integral part of Maroon. He's an integral part of the Shoats family. He's an integral part of just who I am developmentally wise. And so, yeah, that's, and I really can't say enough about the intersection of him and my father. And having more than two fathers, but him being probably at a strong number two. And just how to embrace that all and how to, now I'm very happy to say my father's a police officer. You know, and he's not the police officer that you think about. He's not the cop that y'all know. Half of the cops that y'all know and that people support, they don't have it. They can't cut it. They aren't police in the context that they need to be police. They aren't police that have a spiritual context. They aren't police that go up and scrape up the dead bodies off the block. They aren't the police that stayed in their community and didn't move out of the community because they made a lot of money to move out of the community. They aren't the police that won't stand up and go against police brutality that they see happening. They aren't the police that won't stand up and say, hey, that's not proper code of conduct. I'm crossing the blue line. So I've been afraid to say who this officer is for all of these years for all of the wrong reasons.
Thanks, Russell. And you know, one thing about your dad, I had the privilege of meeting him this 20 years ago now, and I've probably never met a more, you know, it struck me at the time that I'd never met somebody more self-disciplined. But at that point, he had been in solitary confinement, I think, 8-9 years, and he had another 20 years in solitary to go, so 23 hours a day by yourself, 1 hour a day out by yourself, exercise. And he had committed himself to this extremely intense regimen of physical training and reading, just a huge amount of reading to kind of lift his spirit out from the confines of where he was. And Ashley, you've done some research into solitary confinement, right, in the course of this article. People aren't allowed to be locked up for 29 years in solitary anymore, technically, right?
Am I on? Okay. Technically, it shouldn't have happened to Maroon. The United Nations has said that more than 15 days in solitary confinement constitutes torture. And yet we are torturing actively men, women, and children, many of them, in the United States today, every day. And there are lots of ways that people get around the sanctions on torture by, so instead of, if 23 hours a day is what constitutes solitary confinement, then if we only lock you up for 22 and a half hours each day, we skirt the UN regulations about what it means to hold someone in solitary confinement. The United States is a shameful leader among nations, and has been for the vast majority of our history in terms of how we lock up and torture our own citizens and many immigrants in this country. And yet, we tend not to think about it a whole lot. So what I've found, and it is certainly true of your father and my interactions with him, is that people who are placed in these conditions either become these hyper-disciplined, really thoughtful, highly intellectual people who are bent on improving their own lives. And some of those folks really turn to the literature the way that Maroon has done. Other people turn to the arts or to constant letter writing to try to connect with their families. There are lots of different modes of survival tactics for this time in solitary confinement, but almost all of them are these really deep, thoughtful projects of self-improvement. And the people who don't do that literally don't survive. They commit suicide, they go crazy, they're not able to endure those conditions, and particularly children. The suicide rates among children in solitary confinement are absolutely astronomical and appalling. And yet, we are able to sit in comfortable spaces like this one and not think about all the folks who aren't here with us today. So I really appreciated Russell saying that he didn't feel comfortable having this conversation about police without Papa Barnes here by our side. It's very painful and difficult for me to have this conversation about people who are incarcerated without Russell's father, Maroon, being here, without so many people who would love to be a part of this conversation today. There are a lot of really, really brilliant folks in prison who have far better answers than I do about what it is we need to do to get ourselves to a point where we actually believe in the sanctity of human life again, and where we really honor what the gift of each human being really is and looks like. And until we fill spaces like this with people who've come home from prison, with people that we have helped to say we should not be locking up our own people like this every day all the time, until we have managed to have a room where we can have this conversation where there are at least as many people who have survived prison as there are those of us who aren't, then we're failing at something really, really key, both to the fundamental principles of what it is to live in a democracy or in any kind of government that gives people actual liberty. And we're also failing as people who believe in whichever faith has called you. We're failing to honor each other and our God when we forget the people who can't be with us today because they're in prison.
If I could. No, thank you, Ashley. And I just want to add to that quickly that I feel it imperative among communities like the Bruderhof to do the internal struggle and work it is to help us confront these issues, if it's a writer's workshop, whatever it may be, because the community has a leverage. The community has the ability to have a bigger voice than individuals. The community has the ability to be able to leverage the state. The community has the ability to be able to leverage police officers. The community has the ability to leverage writers and other artisans. So we know in all communities there is a responsibility, there's an accountability to do. Now, what the do is, how the do is done is a whole nother different question. But that accountability is there. It does not go away. It doesn't get any smaller. It doesn't stop crying out to you to say, challenge yourself in these ways to figure where it is that the community lands on these questions, because not to land on the question is unacceptable.
Thanks, Russell. I have one more question, and then, of course, I'm sure Russell and Ashley would be happy to talk more with individuals. Russell, we talked about your dad in particular. We talked about Papa Barnes and his, his prayer for, also peace for your dad, right? Would you mind talking a little bit, even just, as much as you feel comfortable with, about your dad's kind of spiritual path, living through 49 years of incarceration and where he's come to now?
Yeah. So thank you, Pete, for that question. Yeah, it's been a journey, Pete, as you know. And Pete said he met my dad. Pete met my dad when my dad was of the mindset, basically, of a lot of political prisoners, Black Panthers, BLA members at that point in time, where they were just like, religion is opiate of the masses. And yeah, thanks, Hoff, for bringing me out of the hole. And we're cool, and we love writing to the kids, and we want to support the kids, and we want to do all of that. But at the end of the day, I'm about liberation, and theology, And so he was one of these people who just was kind of like, the spirituality, and he had, when he came into prison, studied Islam and then found that it had its schisms in prison, as everything has in prison, and that people leveraged Islam in improper ways, and that people just did a lot of things Islamically, internally in the prison that either resonated with him somehow or totally didn't resonate with him. The murder of a warden because by Jojo Bowden, and Jojo Bowden wasn't a Muslim, but Jojo murdered the warden because the warden wouldn't let them have prayer. And he was feeding them pork sandwiches intentionally. So Jojo Bowden murdered the warden, went to have a little meeting with the warden and murdered him and the guards in the room, and then whatever. But I say all of that to say that at that moment, my dad said, I don't know if I want to join you guys Islamically or whatever. It's cool, I get it. Yep, right. And recently, through COVID, through the removal of his upper and lower intestines, through stage 4 colon cancer and rectal cancer, through COVID, through having COVID, all of that medical trauma, and a lot of times medical trauma brings us to spirituality. Trauma in general a lot of times can bring us to spirituality, but medical trauma a lot of times just immediately, makes you recognize your mortality. And I think we all should question our mortality before that moment comes, before medical trauma has to make us question, why are we here? How long are we here? What are we going to do while we're here? If we die tomorrow, what have we done while we're here? Those questions have rushed at him through medical, through all of that. He said, I need to think about my spirituality or my connection to the all. And so in that, he has embraced Islam, and he has embraced a whole different outlook on what struggle means to him, what liberation theology means to him, what that would mean for him being a Muslim. And so now I interact with a new dad, who is every phone call, salam alaikum, and peace be unto you, and when are you taking your shahada, and on and on and on, which is great for me, in the context of him finding something greater than himself, outside of himself, to aspire to, that is tied directly to his politics of liberation. And so it's a new, as Ashley said, my dad has went through all of these different iterations, even the one of sitting with Pete and just, I'm a push-up guy, and to coming to a spiritual place and having some conversations with Ashley and the Hoff that are revealing of his want and need at this point in his life to have conversations with people who he feels is important now to come to and say, hey, I'm a different guy.
Thank you, Russell and Ashley. Please join me in thanking both of them.